As a performer and a creative person in the world, I'll either make things out of music or out of art materials that affect a person in such a way that it's obviously surprising to them. And that gives me pleasure too. Hello, I'm Steve Bernal, and welcome to my work of the last 2 years. This is a show I call Couples. And I'd like to start by describing this piece, which is a moth with a facade. And it was an idea that came to me for 2 reasons, both of whom I am, I guess you could say. And I hope you enjoy it. This way, this piece came about as an idea, not just because of the gamble of life, but because of what it takes to be able to understand risking yourself for a game. And that is the title of it, A Detail of a Game. It is a detail of a close-up of a much larger game. And green is my favorite color too, so I had to put that in somewhere. This one I call Ascension. The nature of which has no real ground or solid mechanism. And it was the beginning of a portion of my working life where, for some reason that I can't really remember right now, I became interested in religious art for a little while. And this is my take on the crucifixion in a fundamental way. There is wine and blood and ascension and the description of the thief and the cross from an angle and perceived in a way that perhaps is unusual. Or I should say conceived in a way that is perhaps unusual. And as a further insight, and maybe giving away too much at the risk of being considered a troublemaker, the androgyny of the crucified individual. And it's one of my favorites, but I guess we'll see about that. This one has a little more tangible nature and origin. I once had the privilege to take a trek in the middle of December in far east Long Island, New York, to Willem de Kooning's home studio in Springs, Long Island. And it just happened to be raining and very cold and windy that day, but the closest I could park my vehicle without being noticed to his home was 4 miles away in a small town called Amagansett. And I knew where I was and I knew where the studio is. So I took it upon myself to make a trek, which is not unlike other religious pursuits. And I made it. And I have a detailed account of it that I will share with everyone soon. And I was able to stand there. I basically snuck onto the property in full view of several cameras and someone whom I think was one of his granddaughters. And I had the distinct impression that they let me do it because they knew I'm harmless and perhaps they understood what I was doing. They knew who I am. And I was on that property for, 30 minutes or so, standing in the rain. It was freezing cold. And I just turned around and walked back to the street. Made the trek back to my vehicle at the Amagansett train station, wherein I hadn't felt so happy in years. The kind of happiness that makes you vibrate and is furthermore difficult to describe. And thinking about it now is giving me a big smile. And the forest that I walked through that day twice doesn't really look like that. It's not as sweet as that, but by the end of my little trek, I felt as though it did. It's hard to describe, but I gave it a shot. In the context of this exhibit, I wanted to hang this one right in the middle before several others that come after it. And the title of this piece is The Temple Entrance. Perhaps in a more obvious way, it refers to the title of the show, which is Couples. And part of my intention, I shouldn't say intention. I don't begin a painting with an intent. I'm not attempting to convey a message specifically. I do have a visual idea of what I want before I even start. But then, as some of you may know, whom practice art, you can have the best intention while starting a painting, and what's going to happen anyway is it's going to tell you what to do. And this was one of those. More strongly perhaps than some of the others. Ostensibly, and perhaps from my own particular vision, it represents a couple seeking the same thing with a venue towards which to motivate. Inside the venue are opposing forces. Surrounding the plinth upon which they both stand in unity are guides, perhaps, one of which matches some of the other opposing forces. And then in between them is what you could, what I consider the heart of the matter, which is a slightly different shade of red as the opposing forces are. But it's passionate. And of course, they don't have limbs, and they're not quite touching. They may not even be looking at each other, but they are standing on the same plinth and joined down there. At any rate, the temple entrance. This one I call Grip of Addiction. And as many of you likely know, that love itself can be its own addiction. Codependency can be its own addiction. And if you're aware of it, you're going to try to correct yourself and cure yourself of any kind of addiction. All of them, of which, of course, there are myriad. It was inspired during the course of some studies of Renaissance art that I took upon myself over the last year or so, couple of years. And I came across a large ceiling mural which has been housed in a place called Burghley House in England since 1697. It was painted by an Italian Renaissance artist named Antonio Verrio. It has been sitting on that ceiling, I should say standing on that ceiling, maybe even holding it up, for 327 years. And it is spectacular. And it's hard to believe how gruesome he portrayed hell in that mural. It is more than life-size. It is just gigantic and gorgeous. And that's on the first floor. And on the floor above it is the antithesis of this mural, which is called Heaven, and which is also equally glorious. However, as we all know, hell is much more interesting, to some of us anyway, than heaven. And I was in the throes of this idea about togetherness and couples and love and anger and all the stuff that goes in between it, which of course is a lot. And I started this idea. And he's an old demon who's perhaps amused with himself by another couple by whom he's separating. And if you look closely, interpretively, I guess you could say, he's surrounded by velvet, which kind of represents a type of fire, but he's also made of fire. His innards are on fire. This hapless soul is being consumed and tormented by this demon, while his muse seeks her freedom, which she almost achieves by escaping the velvet scroll, which has now become a more hot red because of his touch. And maybe she evaporates, and the pillars represent the life that occurs throughout, the consistency of the waywardness of the world at night. And he's watching it and being amused. So that's the grip of addiction. This piece I call A Detail of War. I began it shortly after the Russian-Ukrainian invasion began. And feeling helpless and frustrated because of such atrocities is the burden of an artist, I think, at least a conscious artist. And of course, more recently, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict spurred me on more to say and or do something. So I had this idea, and I made it in such a way where fundamentally both entities are angels. That's where the wings come from. They happen to be in conflict. Of course, one is in more danger than the other, as is usually the case in any war. And the way I wanted it to come across when I was doing it, it was very complex, and I had never done anything like it before, but I wanted it to seem as though you could look at the same picture from two different perspectives that were not necessarily opposing. For example, one, you can look at it as it is, as if he is standing on the same ground that you are, and he's flying in with his attack. Or you could look at it as you're looking at it from above. He's the one standing there, attacking the one who's already down. And the light behind it is the fire of the war itself, the destruction, the flames, the unnecessary flames, I guess you could say. Which, in my mind anyway, brings me back to the idea of couples. Because I've never been in a war, but I would assume even though a war would be happening in or around any place I lived, I would hope to be able to hold the one I loved for the duration. And in this case, I had an idea of flowing id, the flowing idea, the flowing of everything that happens in life, and being guided by an unseen force who perhaps is herself dreaming of the same thing. And these two figures, if you want to call them that, they're not actually figurative, I guess, in the literal sense, but they're not touching the ground. They have their own plinth now. So they're separate, but they're sharing the same idea that was in between them in the temple entrance. And it's up to you to decide whether or not he's giving it to her or she's giving it to him. And he's the male and she's the female. And the pillars support everything above them. And that's my idea. In a more existential sense, getting back to the religious context of everything, which of course is usually a source of conflict, perhaps a beginning of many wars in the history of the world. This is my much simpler and perhaps surrealistic depiction of the Last Supper. There's no way to know if that actually happened. There's no way to know if Da Vinci's depiction of it is accurate. So I made my own version. And the orbs that are on the table, which is one of which is being shared by the supreme angel, the Blessed One, who has already shared one with his disciple at his left hand, who is ready to receive the same thing. Those are the same color of red as in the previous painting and in the temple entrance. And having a propensity for circles, I wanted it to seem as though this covering could come and shelter them all if necessary. And they're arguing over here. These disciples are arguing and contemplating possibilities of what these are, what this represents. I mean, who really knows? And then there's my aspic, my self-piercing aspic, which is an idea I got from listening to King Crimson and while I was reading a book about Salvador Dali. The self-piercing aspic. I don't know how to describe it or what it means yet, but it's part of an orb. It's like the leftovers, the remnants of an orb, perhaps, that is seeking its own truth, you know? And the title of this, the extended title of this one, reads, The Last Supper with Descending Rosary and Self-Piercing Aspic in the Slowly Closing Dome of Hope, circa early 21st century. So make of that what you will. And then there's this guy, which is a bit of a full circle, in my opinion, in my context, I guess, in my imagination. He's natural. He comes from somewhere unusual. He's connected. He's close to the ground, but he's not touching it. And he's still longing, you know, to make sure that he has a home. And again, with the candy apple red orbs of truth, I guess you could say. And he's at peace because he's home, he's in his natural environment, everything's fine, everything's connected to the ground. And it's one of the things I aspire to and hope for in myself. Maybe you do too. It's hard to see. It's hard to achieve sometimes. Sometimes it's hard to get there. Sometimes you need help. Sometimes the ground itself is the help. And I call it the temple garden. And then there are my friends, Paul and Mary. They weren't very happy people, from what I've learned of them. But they were a couple to the end of each of their lives. And when Mary died, I hesitate to admit that I discovered her body. And it spurred on other ideas about longevity and place in the world and the things we do to and for each other, including love and war. And these two had a colorful existence. And I had an idea about how to bring them back together. Paul had died a few years before she did. So I made it seem as though he was already there, and he was cradling her in a little opening cocoon, the color of trees and grass. And showing her with his left hand about where they were going together. And he was already there, and he was wearing the collar of truth, I guess you could say, and sharing it with her, putting it in her hand, through which she extends her fingers to ascend to a lighter place. Instead of the black and dark blues over here, everything is yellow and orange and white, and maybe better. And I call that one Paul and Mary. Which brings us to Bust of Winter, my most recent work, biggest one I've done in a while. And it was spurred on by the idea and the feeling I had when I made the trek to Willem de Kooning's home and studio. And it's hard to tell sometimes where ideas originate. They just grow with their own seeds. And I started the face with graphite pencil, as I often do on canvases, especially the big ones. And I just took it from there. And it's actually a fairly simple piece. There are only 3 different colors in the whole piece. One of which is actually the color of the canvas itself. But it was very satisfying to do because I think it led me to the idea for the next phase of my work, which is a sort of distance between me and it, as opposed to investing my heart and soul and really spending a lot of time on minute details, which, as any artist who may watch this or see this knows, that'll drive us crazy after a while. And I think there's a way to sort of put a veil on it all and still convey the same passion, the same idea, the same amount of yourself in it. And maybe not reveal as much as before. So the couple involved with this particular painting is him and me.